right then. Just to be sure, I believe we have a quorum, but you want to check that, Jane or Marion?
Liz said she was listening in still, but on a call. And so I think you're all set. I think it's just Christine. Peter Bourne's here. Yep, you're all set.
All right. Well, thank you and welcome everybody. Today's main mission is to look at the run-throughs from task leads of the material that we're going to be presenting to the full council on October 5. And I know there was on the agenda, there's a invitation to discuss any lingering issues coming from the presentation we heard last time on modeling. So we should probably begin with that. And I also open to suggestions for changes in the agenda at this point. People have suggestions or requests. All right, not hearing anything there. Let's quickly discuss what we heard from the modelers about the scenarios they're running and their assumptions. And are there lingering questions about that? Is that was on the agenda just to give us the opportunity to discuss, or were there specific issues that people wanted to put in front of the committee?
So I had added that concept, Richard, onto the agenda in part because I know some of our state team had some questions about some of the modeling and wanted to flag some issues for EFG and CADMIS, and just wanted to see it, given the fact that we're going to get better modeling if we get these inputs into them sooner rather than later. Wanted to see if any others had anything that was sort of sticking in their craw or hanging in the back of their mind from our discussion last week.
Thanks, Peter. Is it worth mentioning some of the topics that you said state staff had brought up with them? You're muted.
I would ask, is Brian Woods on? Brian, do you want to talk about some of the things that you had emailed David about? And
yeah,
we can.
Thanks, Peter. Very quickly, you may recall that when EFG was going through the slides in 2025, the modeled emissions reductions in the mitigation pathway were actually less than the target. And so I was trying to understand exactly why that was happening. It's based on the assumptions regarding reductions in each of the sectors. And then I just had additional questions on the share of reductions that was being realized from each of those sectors, particularly in that scenario. So David acknowledged receiving those questions, but in my email to him, I said, you're not answering to me. It's really up to Jane and Peter what the schedule is for replying. And I suggested this could be an opportunity to do it, but I don't know what their schedule is for a reply, but I'm sure it'll be responsive. And then, yeah, others had questions about what they heard last week. Like Peter said, it's a good time to give that to him so they can answer them all at once.
Yeah, David had hoped to join today, but he's under a tight timeline for a deliverable in our contract that's due today. And so he's working on that right now and was able to join, was happy to watch the recording, he said, after. I will just say there, and Liz has her hand up, so hopefully she'll speak to this. There's been a bunch of discussion about the electric sector over the course of the last week as well. And then just so you all know, I gave them a bit of guidance for the presentation on Tuesday based on feedback from the steering committee, that they'll be very focused on providing only updates on new information on Tuesday and really focused on high level synthesis and summary of findings. for the council presentation.
Thanks, Jane. That's really helpful. Liz?
Yeah, my question was going to be on whether there had been any further discussion on electric sector, and I was going to ask Ed, or I don't know if TJ's on this call, just other people at GMP who had a chance to look at the documents that were posted on the website, just had similar questions about, various choices that looked like they had been made and where they came from and what they meant in terms of carbon reduction goals. So it felt like a worthwhile conversation, and I just wanted to make sure it was happening. So sounds like it is. I don't know if there's more of an update there from anyone on the state side.
Did I hear though, Brian, in your question, a concern about the sort of the rapid pace of reductions being modeled for 2025? And because I recall David's answer on the call was, well, yeah, it looks like we're overachieving in 25, but that's realistic because to get to 2030, we have to be on a steeper slope. Is that one of the questions that you were asking him about?
I wouldn't say it's a concern. I'm still in the phase of trying to understand how this model works versus other optimization models, which I'm more familiar with that wouldn't necessarily do that. They would take you on a least course path. But yeah, this is driven by the assumptions that go into where the reductions are coming from. So I think that overachievement in 2025 is it's potentially a trajectory issue. But then I'm still trying to understand, what sectors are contributing how much of the reductions and why, in order to be able to do that. As you know, I don't want to take up too much time. Some things need to be implemented earlier to be able to get to 2030, and some things don't. And exactly what they are and in what sectors, I'm working through the LEAP model. I have a copy of it, but I don't profess to be an expert, and looking for EFG's guidance on that.
So Brian, this is Ed. Does that get into, this is something I remember TJ talked about maybe a month or two ago. Essentially, the business as usual case assumes all the current policies that are in place, including, we're doing weatherization, we're doing EVs, heat pumps, the renewable energy standard as it is right now. So that was my memory, is that business as usual actually gets us to 2025. It's the further getting us to 2030 that's going to be particularly difficult.
That came up in science and data, as I recall, but I want to confirm it, is that like business as usual gets us very close. And so the additional activity, gets us to that goal. I've been focused on the mitigation, reviewing the mitigation case, and honestly, Ed, really just trying to work my way around LEAP and figure out where everything is. But yeah, it's related. It certainly is related to that, where the 2025 goal isn't as aggressive as the 2030 goal. So things that are in place to get there may, take us below the 2025 goal.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Anything else on this topic?
Yeah,
Liz?
I mean, sorry, just back to electric sector.
Yeah.
I apologize. I didn't get an answer, which is fine if there isn't one. I just wanted to make sure we circled back.
And so, Liz, I have not talked to anybody from GMP about any specific questions, and I have not connected with David Hill in the last week. And so I think there is, and Jane, maybe I'll work with you to set that up to ensure we're closing the loop there.
Yeah, or Jane had mentioned there were a lot of discussions in the last week on electric sector. So it's possible any of the things that we talked about in the last meeting with Dave, it's possible they're getting addressed. I just wanted to make sure they were.
Yeah, I would imagine TJ's been in close contact with David as well. And so I'll close the loop there.
Yeah, there's what I haven't, admittedly, because there's been so many emails about it, dove in deeply, but I have it open now, and there's been a lot of back and forth, and there were concerns about components that were built into the model from SEI, and so there's back and forth, and it looks like SEI is fixing it. But I see TJ's been involved as well, but I'll just forward you both the final outcome of that email right now, so you have it.
Great, thank you.
Ed, is there any concern that the modeling that's being done here it will end up somehow being inconsistent with the modeling being done for the comprehensive energy plan? Is that staying linked?
No, all the updates that we're making for the CAP are being reflected in the CEP model, and it's all one model, as TJ likes to say. It's one model for both. So as we improve upon it based on your recommendations and actions, that goes back into what's informing the CEP too.
Yeah, we're from the PSD perspective, we're very committed to ensuring the consistency with the CEP with the CAP, and a necessary component of that is the modeling. So as Jane said, even though David is working on sort of their own version of the model, they're looping back to ensure that SEI actually has the model for both, and that changes are being incorporated into sort of the master model, so to speak.
All right, terrific, thank you. I realized we skipped over a minute ago the approval of the minutes of the last meeting. I guess I should ask. Are we okay to do that? Peter says, all right. Hearing no objection, as usual, we deem them approved. All right, we're ready for run through, I guess you'd say, of the presentations we're going to be presenting to the council. You folks ready to roll? Joey, I think you and Gina are up first.
Yeah, I mean, the dog ate our homework.
Can I just ask, before we dig in, it would be helpful for me to remind me again, the presentation that we're going to walk through today is essentially the Excel sheet that we sent you. We don't have any other tidier presentation.
My understanding, Jane, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the PowerPoint slides that you sent out are what we are to be walking through.
We have not sent out any PowerPoint slides. We birthed a spreadsheet yesterday, and we plan to put a presentation together in the next few days. We drafted a whole bunch of ideas. They're not in an orderly fashion. So I think what's important maybe for this group is for them to understand what's on the spreadsheet, and we could do a overview of that relatively quickly. But there's a lot of sort of framing that is still, we have the ideas written down, we just haven't plugged them into a PowerPoint. Where I was planning to do that. We were planning to do that this weekend. How important is that? We can run over what those things are. We can talk about what's on the spreadsheet, which was a monumental task. And that's all we're prepared to do. We do not have slides prepared as of right now. So what's your favorite?
Just to confirm, you do have the template from Jane of the PowerPoint.
If you could resend that, that'd be terrific. Because the template that I saw Billy using the other day wasn't the template that I thought we were going to use. The presentation that we saw earlier this week. Is that the same template, or is that a different one?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, everybody can take liberty. Like you'll see today with Liz and Ed's, they've taken liberty to make it more visually appealing and communicative, which is really great. But it was intended to be a guide, and people have taken liberty with it to improve upon the template, which is fine.
So basically the template is sort of overview, framing issues, how we got here, strategies briefly, actions meaty. That's the,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the intent is that they have not seen all of your strategies, because the last time was really focused on pathways. This time should focus on your strategies. However, the real crux is to elevate, you know, action items where
Uh-huh.
folks might have any contentious, you know, want to talk about or dive in to give you guidance on over the course of the next few weeks as you prioritize and finalize them. I also think that, you know, with Ag and Eco and Rural Resilience, they were challenged by the fact that they have 100+ actions. So they really focused on their strategies and then put a lot of expectation in that the council had reviewed those spreadsheets ahead of time. If there's, with all of you, your actions and strategies seem much more targeted and strategic here and are not as, you know, as big of a sort of monster to deal with in communicating. So I think really if you can focus in on the actions in your presentation, that's going to be very well received.
Yeah, I mean, we've always assumed that the actions are the policy levers, the how, the what are the strategies, the actions are the how, and the strategies are actually are pretty minor. I mean, they're not minor, they're big baskets of stuff. And then the strategies are the devil will be in the detail. And we're not going to have time to get into those details in this presentation. We'll frame them up a little bit, but that's about it. So, I mean, that's where we are right now. If the group wants, we can.
Can I just ask a question in terms of like taking everything that we put into an Excel sheet and dumping it into a PowerPoint? Like, I wonder if it seems to me just walking through the Excel sheet that we delivered as opposed to a PowerPoint seems more helpful in my opinion.
I would disagree only because I just don't know how you do that effectively to a large group of people. And I really, you know, the website's down, so I was trying to look at what was up for you all. And Marion's working hard to recover documents right now, but we had actions for transportation and all of your sectors posted already for a number of days now. And what I'm hearing perhaps is that you have a revised spreadsheet to post and that the other one should be taken down.
No,
but you'll notice that I
we
have directed, okay, let me just finish real quick, Gina.
Yeah.
I have already directed the council to be looking at that and really stressed, I thought in my email this time, that's how beholden it is on council members to come having looked at these materials, because there is no way that we can walk them through every component, and they need to be able to bring up issues that they see as issues independent. But I also think that the intent of the presentations, albeit I will say Ag and Eco and Rural Resilience didn't do this as effectively as one would have hoped, is to really elevate the actions that you want to elevate because of the guidance that I put in the email around the presentation, which is really like red flags, where you might have disagreement challenges, or where you're really seeking a broad nexus of like momentum and help with advancing it across the finish line. So that's the goal. And I find PowerPoint like a visual way to do that. So it's not just focused on you. If a PowerPoint is not a tool that you want to use, then we can revisit how best to do that.
No, I agree. I agree what you just said. That's really, really important stuff. And it's not information that gets conveyed on the spreadsheet. But just to be clear,
I'm just trying to figure out, my question is more based on what you were saying in the end, Jane. It's like, how do we lift it? Because we have 40% of the emissions in the state of Vermont, trying to figure out what we lift up and put on a PowerPoint as opposed to what's in an Excel sheet is really what I'm trying to get at. So maybe best process would be to turn to someone else who has done their homework first so that we can learn from that, and then we can walk through what we have, which is just the Excel sheet.
So I'm going to agree with that. And I do think, Joey and Gina, that today you could take us through your latest work, tell us what your highest priorities are, and that would give you some feedback on that will give you some sense of what needs to be on the slides, recognizing that that's really a more effective way to talk to an audience that hasn't seen this stuff before. So let's just do what you suggested and see whether Dave is ready to show us a presentation on buildings.
Okay, before we turn to Dave, who is good for Dave and Christine for doing your homework. Sorry, we did not. But I guess I agree that a PowerPoint is more visually, but I guess what in terms of what we lift, our goal is to have that be informed by the conversation with you all. So that's why we did not do the PowerPoint yet. So we want to
So it's a little bit unfair to us, Joey, because we all did that homework. And so we have the things to bring to you to have a discussion about what we lift up. And so we're going to do that through the draft PowerPoint to be able to share that and get feedback from you all. And it's going to be harder for us to do that because you guys don't have your homework done. And I just, I'm sorry, I'm a little frustrated. This is like the fourth time we've had this conversation around what was due when and why it's been laid out.
I disagree. So we worked hard with your staff all week on that spreadsheet. We worked really hard on it with your staff, following their guidance. No one once said we need to have the PowerPoint. I had it in the back of my head, and last weekend I spent a lot of time developing the information that would go into this PowerPoint. And we can walk through that right now in just a few words, and this group can have a conversation, and we can put the spreadsheet up on the screen so people can see it, and we can have the same conversation. We just won't have it in the nice little PowerPoint format. We have done our homework, and I'm a little resentful that's saying that we haven't. We worked incredibly hard.
All right, guys.
I'm sorry, that's it.
I thank you. I look forward to it. We'll have a discussion of the spreadsheet when you put it up. Dave, and Christine isn't on, right? It's just you.
That's correct. Are you able to see my screen? Are you able to see that?
Oh, there you go.
You able to see that? Okay, good.
Yep.
Yeah,
I appreciate the artist, Dave.
Thanks. I hear somebody in the background, so please mute. So anyway, good afternoon, everybody. We got trouble if Farnsworth is the organized one, but it's not really me that's organized. It's Christine who organized. Christine and Brian have organized me. So good afternoon, everybody. Let's go with this. So I'm speaking on behalf of Christine Donovan and myself. We want to thank Brian Woods and Christine for all their help, their expertise, their patience has been really important here at pulling these recommendations together. This slide lists some of the materials we reviewed in our preparation, some of the experts, in addition to public commenters who've been really generous in sharing their time and thoughts with us. So we appreciate their help as well. Before we start in earnest here, I'd like to touch on some essential background themes I think are really important. The first is buildings themselves. Vermont buildings pose a significant challenge to equitably meeting Global Warming Solution Act goals. Vermont's building stock is dominated by buildings older than 1975. A quarter of our buildings are older than 1939. 1939, that's FDR, that feels like ancient history. But buildings built before 1939 are what Vermonters have to deal with today. And of course, it's the third decade of the 21st century. So perhaps thermal modernization is a way to think about the challenges here. That's buildings. Fuel expenditures. Buildings are about a third of our greenhouse gas emissions. They're more than a third of our expenditures. ANR tells us in 2018, nearly $770 million spent on fossil fuel by Vermonters. EAN reports that 67% of that left the Vermont economy. That's fuel expenditures, housing burden, energy burden. Those are terms you're going to hear today. That's a percent of income that Vermont households spend on these things, the percent of one's income. On average, Vermonters spend about 10% of their income on energy expenses, about $5,800. The actual range is roughly from 6% to about 20%. Considering housing and energy costs together, the Vermont Housing Finance Agency tells us that over 35% of Vermonters are cost burdened. That's about 90,000 Vermonters. Of those 90,000 Vermonters, about a third of them spend over 50% of their income on housing. That's housing burden, energy burden. Rentals is the final point I just want to emphasize here. Of Vermont's 330,000 more or less homes, 1/4 are intended for use for renters. Recall the median construction year of 1975 for all Vermont housing. For rental housing, the median construction year is 1964. Ancient history again. Lyndon Johnson. Efficiency Vermont and the VHFA tell us that 80% of renters in Vermont are categorized as low income. 1/4 of renters pay between 30 to 49% of their income for housing. Another quarter pays in excess of 50% of its income for housing. So just to summarize here, given the quality of the buildings that we've got, the cost of fuels, the number and income status of Vermonters who rent, it's critical that we think that Global Warming Solutions Act recommendations incorporate social equity into those recommendations. The recommendations we make need to address buildings and fuel use, but in a way that will minimize adverse effects on low-income households and those most burdened by high energy bills. That's by way of background. So we've identified 2 pathways, both of which concern equitably reducing building-related carbon emissions. One pathway involves improving building efficiency, the other, reducing carbon content of fuels used in buildings. Let's talk about strategies associated with pathway 1. There are 3. I'm going to focus on 2 of them today: weatherization at scale and rental property efficiency standards. So weatherization at scale, we recommend 2 actions under this strategy. First, adopt weatherization at scale working group recommendations. Adopt those recommendations. And secondly, authorize the administration to coordinate their implementation. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, and 4 there, this will involve increasing funding that's commensurate with the scale of weatherization that's needed. Currently, there's funding that comes from the forward capacity market and from RGGI allowance sales. Forward capacity market funding is going away. RGGI allowance sales are increasing, but they're too small a fraction of what is needed here. So while that's great, there needs to be more in the way of funding. This working group has identified additional federal funding opportunities: the pending infrastructure bill, ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, and they also reference the Act 62 report that recommends an all fuels related charge of some sort. Workforce development, and that's the focus of many organizations and parts of the state government, but we recommend that workforce development is focused and coordinated by one leading organization in state government. Financial counseling is another element of this. Many organizations in the state provide and deliver counseling services, but we recommend that one lead organization is designated and that they support the other organizations that are doing this. Again, coordinating and focusing this. The 4th element of weatherization at scale is tariff on bill financing. That's an approach designed for individuals to make efficiency investments, but in a way that'll help them overcome the upfront costs that are often a barrier to those investments. The idea of tariff on bill financing is that the utility bill and meter is the locus of the charge, and that no individual takes on financial liability. So when we look at the keys to success here of this particular approach, it builds on our expertise. We don't have to invent this. Vermont has deep expertise and years of experience doing weatherization. We've been doing this for years. Efficiency Vermont sells this expertise around the world. Okay, what we need to do now is to fund it and to find ways of funding. As far as equity goes, we think that the partnership model here encourages all participants involved here, all the stakeholders, whether it's building owners, occupants, and fuel providers, to work toward the same goals. And we think that's a good way of ensuring greater equity in this sector. Like weatherization, we have expertise in workforce development and in financial counseling. We just need to coordinate those things. We recommend one action under Pathway 1 Strategy 2, and that's a rental property efficiency standard. Now, this approach is to support the development of a statewide program to help landlords improve the comfort and efficiency of their properties through financial support and education. The keys to success here: a rental efficiency portfolio, a rental efficiency standard would adopt modest efficiency standards for rental units. It would have a long implementation timeframe. It would encourage early action, provide financial support and training for landlords, including rebates, low-cost energy assessments, technical assistance. It's really important that folks understand the scope of this approach. What you're trying to do is not encompass every rental unit in the state. What you're trying to do is identify the worst performing rentals. You're not trying to capture everybody who's renting a piece of property in the state. Mom and pop rentals who have fixed up a room and are trying to rent out that room. It's not the point of this. What we're trying to do is focus on sophisticated buildings, sophisticated landlords, and get them to improve the quality, bring up the floor, in other words, of their units. The ability to participate in a clean heat standard allowance market is also something that I'll talk about shortly, but I think is another important element that would make this approach successful. Equity considerations here of improving the efficiency of anybody's housing will be good for all occupants, certainly housing and energy burden ones. And there's concern over improved properties pricing out current renters. And one thing that an element of this program might be to make sure that financial support to landlords is conditioned on them not changing rents, for example, for a period of years. Let's talk about strategies associated with Pathway 2. There are two of these: implement a clean heat standard and adopt appliance standards for water heaters that allow them to be controlled and their energy use managed. We recommend one action under Pathway 2, Strategy 1, a clean heat standard. In order to meet emissions reduction goals, Vermont needs to transition away from its current carbon-intensive building heating practices, and to do this equitably by recognizing economic effects on both energy users, obviously, and on the workforce that's developing, that's currently providing these services. A clean heat standard is designed to encourage fossil fuel providers serving Vermonters to decarbonize their fuel supply. Like a renewable portfolio standard that requires electric utilities to provide some percentage of their energy from renewable resources, a clean heat standard would be applied in a competitively neutral fashion to all major suppliers of heating fuels in Vermont, and it would require them to reduce the carbon intensity of the energy that they provide. Keys to success here: because this is a performance standard, it allows suppliers to choose how they're going to make this transition. It also provides choice to energy users as to how they're going to participate here. The Vermont PUC, in this design of a clean heat standard, would be the agency to implement this. And they are in a position to establish a growing annual obligations to meet Global Warming Solutions Act goals and to make sure that they're applied in a fair manner. Equity considerations. A clean heat standard should incorporate policies to minimize the potential for adverse effects on energy and housing burden Vermonters. So program details I'm not going to go into today, but there are ways to provide more favorable treatment to certain parts of the population. Furthermore, a clean heat standard should coordinate with existing fuel assistance programs and housing programs. And because, as I mentioned, the clean heat standard provides for a path for fuel deliverers to comply with this transition, It's fair in the way it treats fuel suppliers and their employees, and it allows them to make a transition. We recommend one action under Pathway 2, Strategy 2, the adoption of an appliance standard for water heaters sold in Vermont. And that standard would require them to have a modular demand response communications port. And furthermore, we recommend that the DPS is authorized to work with neighboring states to adopt similar standards. Managing the electricity use of roughly 25,000 water heaters that Vermont households replace each year to less expensive and potentially less carbon intensive times of the day is a really important goal to achieve. Vermont has to make sure that its water heaters are efficient, but also controllable. Directing Vermont utilities to exploit the demand response and system resiliency opportunities associated with water heaters will be another key to success. Encouraging neighboring states, especially those neighboring states that have just gone through this in the last year. In other words, legislatures have passed their own and not their own efficiency standards and have not waited for DOE and a federal standard to come down. Coordinating with those states, we think makes sense to develop a similar standard for water heaters that would create a regional push to transform the water heater appliance market. We think that this approach will further equitable practices. It'll help avoid unnecessary electrification costs that could disproportionately affect housing and energy burdened Vermonters. Frequently, when we hear electrification discussed, in the next breath, people talk about the investment in the power system required to accommodate electrification. That's a mistake. There is an earlier step that should be thoroughly explored, which is the optimization of the existing system. This is the sort of thing we all are pretty familiar with. You charge your car in the middle of the night because electricity is cheaper than it is at 5 in the afternoon. Same idea with water heating. This will also improve power grid management to enable further adoption of lower cost, non-polluting renewable resources, which is another goal that Vermont has. It'll improve the resilience of the system, and it'll help transform the water heater market. I think that's it. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to trying to answer your questions.
Comments and questions. I have a couple myself, and maybe there are others. Liz, then Joey.
Sure, awesome, really, really great to see this and great presentation. 3 comments on weatherization at scale. I've said before, so I'll repeat myself, but we're getting closer to the actual report, so maybe it's a better time, especially given some of what we saw in the Rural Resilience Committee and what the electric sector has, kind of looked at but deferred given other recommendations that are being developed elsewhere. It would be great to broaden the way we think about weatherization at scale and all of the various coordination and programs that you put under that to also include as needed electrification measures so that one of the things people can choose is electricity as a lower carbon option when needed. And it's also the one touch, give everybody the option at the same time you're coordinating on weatherization issue. So I feel like this is the moment where we need to say that again and then think about how we're going to actually wrap that into a report, because everything you said could have an and electrification, panel upgrades, et cetera, like rural resiliency spoke about, that would also support your water heater ideas and the use of heat pumps and other things. And I feel like this is the time to make sure that's included. Comment number 2 is on the clean heat standard. And it's really just a question as you think about both the presentation next week and then the eventual report, what level of detail are you going to suggest that the council adopt there in order to strive for a strong recommendation that can then be, investigated and implemented through the process that will inevitably have to occur. And the specific thing that made me think about that as you presented was the issue of PUC jurisdiction over the eventual process. Totally understand the recommendation, might be a really great way to do it, and will certainly be among other choices that could exist, as well as raise questions regarding the lack of rate regulation for those dealers. So it just gives me the opportunity to say, is that the level of detail you're going to want to try to get consensus from the council on, or will you instead present it more like, options including jurisdiction by the PUC? Third comment is on your water heater idea. So, again, you might consider just giving a point to other appliances having similar load control features as they're developed in the market, and Vermont strongly encouraging and the utilities strongly advocating for the use of those in addition to water heaters. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. Those are really helpful comments.
Joey, you're up.
Okay, thanks, Dave. It's a great example for us to follow. We will work to follow in your footsteps. It's very helpful. Appreciating what you put out there and appreciating what Liz's comments in general. And then one of my questions sort of relates to it, but it is related to the sort of the fuel switching and the opportunity, putting a finer point on sort of exactly what Liz is alluding to, like how do we at the moment in time help people use cleaner, probably electric options for heating in particular. I'd love to see that. If you have more thoughts on that or could put a finer point, that would be great. And then my only other thought was because I don't know if people know what weatherization at scale means, I also think it would be helpful to put some numbers out there that speak to what that is. Is that 120,000 per the goal that EIN has identified? I think it would be to contextualize for people beside a more vague at scale concept, the scale that we're actually talking about.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Joey. So a couple of comments. I like your organization quite a lot, Dave. I agree with some of the comments already made, that in particular, the importance of linking the clean heat standard and the weatherization program. The two working groups that are working on this have done so in alignment all the way through, because we recognize the benefits of what Liz referred to, I think, as one touch, minimizing transaction costs and taking advantage of the opportunity to weatherize. And I use the term heat switch as opposed to fuel switch, to do heat switching at the same time as weatherization whenever that's feasible. And frequently it won't be. Frequently end users aren't going to want to do everything all at once. But even a graphic that would show your main messages, just showing a picture, a drawing of a building, and the weatherization component and the heat switching component of it, and the water heater component of it, if you want to, would help people to follow along, I think, a little better. And the slides that you presented are all words. Then a little bit of a bar chart, for example, as Joey recommended, or a graphic showing that I think the listener is going to wonder what's clean heat. And you emphasize that it gives both providers and customers choice, but it would be helpful to say choice amongst what? Not everybody wants a pellet stove. Not everybody wants a heat pump. What's renewable natural gas? What are biofuels? There's a bunch of options that would satisfy the clean heat standard. And that's one of its attractions. So I think it would be useful to even have a graphic of showing what those things are, or at least a list of them. And then finally, my last comment has to do with the structure, which is great. I think people will get a little bit lost in pathway 1, strategy 2 as the way of organizing this. I just think you have 5 recommendations and here they are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I think that's just Richard, jump in there quickly. I think those need to stay in there because it ties back to the spreadsheet and helps people sort of follow along to the more detailed information. So I do think it's useful to tie that in. I get that it's a little bit of an inside baseball thing, but if you are getting into the details, it'll be important to go follow along.
Yeah, I think I would note that it would be on the slide, but it doesn't have to be the main way we organize the presentation.
Yeah, I think we could leave it on the slide without sort of talking about it. Here's strategy 1, pathway 2, like that mattered exactly how it was labeled.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Ma'am? You're muted.
Thank you. You mentioned the clean heat standard would help consumers and fuel distributors transition. I wonder if you can just say a few more words about how we help the fuel distributors transition from what they're doing now to their role in a clean energy future.
Sure, happy to do that. What this allows, a clean heat standard allows fuel dealers to project into the future how they're going to meet the requirements of that standard. For example, and this is just to illustrate, each year you have to reduce by 2% the carbon content of your overall fuel service. It'll allow them to decide how to go about doing that and to choose from all the different elements that Richard just pointed out that I really failed to illustrate in this draft. So what it allows a fuel dealer to do is add biodiesel, is to add other renewable elements to the fuel it currently provides, or to sell heat pumps to a customer, or sell windows or other efficiency or other appliances. It gives them all sorts of choices. And so what it does is it allows them to transition, if they're inclined to, and to reflect that transition in what they're asking of their employees. So at some endpoint, what you've got is a fuel service provider, but maybe they provide propane and fuel oil, but they also provide all these other services. And that way they're allowed to comply with the program on the one hand, but to plan for that and to do that in a way without completely upsetting their current business model, which, for instance, just a more draconian approach to reducing carbon from dealers might do.
Thank you. I don't want to take any more time on this, just to note my concern that a two-person operation, family owned, with 2 heating oil trucks, just having trouble imagining how they do this transition, and want to make sure that we don't forget the need to ensure that those businesses and those people have a path into a clean energy economy.
Ram, I should have added one other element here that's important and I think would apply to the specific example you're thinking of. This is a credit system. So if out of the gate a company is just too small and doesn't have that flexibility, it has to figure out how to reach solutions in a longer term. If it just out of the gate is unable to do that, they're able to acquire credits under this program from another company that's able to do things that allow it to meet its requirements plus do other things. So there's a little bit more flexibility there, but I appreciate your observation. Thank you.
Jared.
Well, I'll get to what I was planning to say in just a second, but just to follow up directly on what David was just saying, I think another key point there is that as the clean heat standard has been designed, the obligation would be at the wholesale fuel provider level. So they would be the ones required to purchase the credits, not mom and pop fuel dealers. But just to go back a second, I just want to thank you, Dave and Christine, for all of your good work, this great presentation. I think there's a lot of really good content there. There's just one thing I'm wondering, and maybe this is because I have not seen, or I may have missed the spreadsheet that has the pathway strategies and actions all listed out, not just the main ones that you're elevating for our attention here. If I recall correctly, there had also been discussion at some point of true cost pricing on new equipment purchases, also known sometimes as fee and rebate or fee-bate programs. Is that still in there? And first I want to ask that question, but then I also just want to reserve time to make a comment on a very specific piece that I think is important to include.
It's not in there. We should talk about that if you think it needs to be included.
Yeah, I would say that I think it's especially important. You know, there are some fuels and some heating systems that can transition. Fuel oil systems can use B100 biodiesel as a drop-in replacement. We already have some forward-looking, responsible fuel dealers who are already providing that, like Bourne's, and I know that Peter is with us. And we know from Vermont Gas that they have made a significant public commitment to increasing their purchases of renewable natural gas. My biggest concern in terms of consumer protection and in terms of lock-in that would avoid, that could hold us back from meeting our emissions reduction requirements and runs the risk of locking Vermonters into the highest cost and most price volatile heating option is with regard to propane. Propane is about 19% of all our heating energy in Vermont. There is no renewable or low carbon alternative currently available to it, nor, as I understand it, is there any expectation of any time in the next decade that there would be that alternative in the way that there is for B100 biodiesel or renewable natural gas. I know that there has been research and development and that there's technical possibilities around dimethyl ether or DME or synthetic propane, but those are not available and not anywhere close to being available. So in the meantime, I think we need to focus on equipment standards and fee-bate programs to help make sure that at the point of purchase of new equipment, we are phasing out the sale of propane water heaters and propane heating equipment. Again, both from a consumer protection perspective, because they are so high cost and price volatile, and also because if we lock in the sale and use of those pieces of equipment, we will not be able to meet our longer term emissions reduction goals, especially when they, 2025 may not be an issue, but our emissions reduction targets are 3 times more stringent in 2030. And if that equipment has been locked in, it's going to be really difficult to move beyond it. So I just think that is worth some particular focus. And I'd like to see more elevation or inclusion of equipment standards and possible fee bates or phase outs of equipment for which there is not a no or low carbon alternative.
Thanks, Jared.
Thank you, Jared. Peter Walk.
I'm going to cede most of my time to Peter Bourne because I want to hear from him specifically, but we do need to wrap up. I did want to address Kaya's question in the chat, which is really about sort of question around financial counseling. I think that may have been lost a little bit, Kaya, in that the goal isn't just financial counseling, it's sort of one touch, as Liz was mentioning, the ability to help Vermonters make multiple transitions at once. And that's knowledge, that could be financing, that could be incentives, like access to incentives, et cetera, along the way that help with all of those things. And so that really was what that was getting at, not just sort of direct financial So, and I'm happy to hand it back to Peter.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of points I'd like to just touch on. The one, when you talk about the fossil fuels leaving, the dollars leaving Vermont, if you could separate that from motor fuels to heating fuels. In my world, recognizing heating fuels are where we can make the biggest difference. It would be nice to be able to kind of look at that as a comparison. The bio products that are available in heating oils, which we've been doing for a number of years, are working quite well. And we do have a number of B99 customers, but as it comes to the 1 and 2 truck family operations, as Jared mentioned, the wholesale, that will be, I would expect it will become more available at the wholesale level. There is one wholesaler now that you can purchase pre-blended, and I'm sure the others will follow in place as the marching orders become more clear that the market is there for the product. The one concern I would have is making sure the bio component of the product is indeed the product that we want to have, as in not palm oil, for a blatant comparison. The other thing, and Jared again kind of touched on this, is the propane. And to my knowledge, he is correct. But what we have going on here is a little customers are concerned about oil tanks in their basements. So we're finding many homeowners are switching from oil to propane because they want to remove the oil tank from any possible future issues for them. And so we're kind of seeing that trending away. And I'm not sure how to address that question or that dilemma that they may be creating, but it is something that has been going on for the last, I'm going to say 2 or 3 years, when the oil tanks really became, required inspections every 3 years and things of that nature. But thank you. This is a great stuff put together. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Peter Walk, back to you. Do you have anything?
Sorry, that's a phantom hand.
Okay.
We're ready to
Thank
move
you all.
on.
A bunch of terrific
to the next.
comments. Really useful comments. Thank you. Shall we move to electricity?
Sure, that's fine with me. Is Ed on? He is. Ed, do you want to do a run through, or do you want me to do it?
If you want to start, and I'll jump in when you want.
Great. So I just first want to acknowledge and appreciate that it's completely dumb luck, 100%, that you actually have a slide presentation from us today. Let's just say it was just in time. So I very much understand the concerns that were raised earlier about getting all of this done. Also appreciating and understanding that the electric sector recommendations that Ed and I have shared with you before and are putting forth again today really are built on a backbone of a lot of other work in other places, including what Dave just went over and what rural resiliency went over. Ag and Ecosystems mentioned some that are electric sector focused. So what we have very much focused on specific mitigation, meaning further greenhouse gas reductions in the electric sector purchases. So it's a fairly narrow set of recommendations as a result. We can skip over process to date. I don't know who's controlling slides. Again, context for this particular part of the work is what this group has talked about before, that the immediate and very significant challenges are in other sectors. That doesn't mean that we need to, or that we shouldn't continue progress in the electric sector in all the ways we've discussed and heard public comment about. But I do think it is an important aspect for this cross-sector subcommittee to grapple with and then bring to our fellow council members, that the electric sector needs to support further decarbonizations in the other sectors first and foremost, in order to make sure we're getting toward our goal, while at the same time working on related strategies in adaptation and resiliency, as well as further study as laid out by other subcommittees, such as on greenhouse gas emissions. So just wanted to put that context there before the far less detailed work that you're about to see compared to the building sector is presented. So the three pathways that we have, first, to further decrease greenhouse gas emissions from electric sector purchases, building on the progress that we have already with the 75% goal by 2032. Second, to enable Vermonters to cost effectively switch to electric. And here we did make sure to include for this audience and for the council, other low carbon fuels. We're talking about electric, but we are not, we have heard feedback and are making sure to include a broader message, as we hope others will do as well, so that heating and transportation can decarbonize. And then finally, to support further greenhouse gas emissions reductions within the electric sector, as well as to help control the overall costs, we need to use and generate electricity in ways that support those goals. So next slide. For the first pathway, we've discussed this before, the 100% carbon-free or renewable electric portfolio standard. It's a renewable standard in Vermont now. It's likely to continue to be, but one way or the other, moving to 100% for implementation post 2030. And some utilities are expecting to be there by 2030, is a very strong recommendation that we can and should bring forward. And the action there is to, as we've discussed in the past, identify very specifically the many sets of issues that will have to be addressed. This is a legislative ask because that's where the res lives, and provide some context and information for those legislative decisions that need to be made, with the overall goal of moving to 100%. Second pathway. Ed, do you want to take over so they don't just hear me?
Sure. Can you actually hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Sorry. I'm sharing the screen, so I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing. So second pathway is the enabling. Vermont, to enable Vermonters to cost effectively shift to electric low carbonization measures generally. So overall strategy, provide financial and also importantly technical assistance, and specifically focused on upgrading electric service and the ability to purchase and install future electrification equipment. So the specific actions, develop a coordinated program working with the weatherization folks, building on the work that Dave talked about earlier. Coordinated programs for assisting with upgrading the panel service, basically from 100 to 200 amp service. Looking at equity issues, focus on providing financial support to those who are income qualified and also rural and marginalized communities. And then finally, put particular focus on delivery to rural communities, thinking about the overlap with high resilience needs. So those in areas that are more prone to outages, just because of topography, geography, other things as well, and also focus on multifamily residential mobile home communities across the state. And then the last pathway, use and generate electricity. This is similar to Dave's idea or Dave's thoughts about demand response for hot water heaters. Basically build on that and think about ways that we can lower GHG emissions, help control overall costs. So strategy, prioritize continued efficiency, keep having Efficiency Vermont do the good work that they're doing, and prioritize more load control and choreography of generation of load. Specific actions would be, continue the efficiency programs, and then primarily through the PUC and different PUC proceedings, dockets, whatever. Also integrated resource plans. These are something that every electric utility has to prepare every 3 years. How do they provide least cost service to meet in a way that meets GWSA requirements? Rate cases before the PUC, start talking much more about utility load control programs, energy service company participation. How do you encourage more pilots? How do you come up with more programs? This is something that the DPS has been working on in recent years, and we basically just need to up our game on it a little bit. And there are some aspects of this are going to be showing up in the comprehensive electric plan as well. The other action, encourage utilities to continue to explore dynamic offerings for customers, specifically generation load matching. How do you encourage, when you have self-sited generation, to actually use as much of that on site as possible before exporting to the grid? And anything you want to add, Liz, before we throw it open?
No, there's some further detail in the spreadsheet that didn't make it onto the slides that folks should feel free to review and comment on. We do have some questions as we move toward the final plan on how some of the goals and measurements will be coordinated with the CADMIS work that we talked about earlier. So a little bit of that's TBD in terms of number of heat pumps and other measures. And the only other thing I'd say is this pathway 2 is the one that I had in mind when commenting to Dave. It feels like there's a way to not have two separate things, but to have one thing, because it feels very much like pathway 2 could be coordinated with the better detail that you have with your weatherization at scale. I'll stop there.
Comments and questions? I'll start with one. I like your presentation quite a lot. One of the things that strikes me is that in both the buildings and electric presentations, there's not much emphasis on end use energy efficiency. Except of course, weatherization as a whole, makes that point. And there's kind of an assumption that Vermont's methods for delivering energy efficiency in the electric utility arena will continue, which is great. I mean, I think it's, I work for an organization that's been saying efficiency first for about 30 years. And it's great that it's kind of taken for granted that that's going to happen. But I think it's useful to actually say so.
Yeah, I completely agree, Rich. We do have that in the slides, but I think that might actually be bringing it up to the first context slide of, we already have one of the best energy efficiency programs in the entire nation, and we're continuing to see efficiency meet a significant portion of existing and expected future load growth as well.
It's just worth reminding everybody that.
Yep.
Bram?
You're muted again, Bram.
So many people wish I'd spend more time muted that it's rare that anyone asks me to unmute. Liz and Ed, I'm wondering how optimistic or concerned are you over the next, relatively short term, 5 years, 7 years, that production of non-fossil fuel energy will keep up with all the new demands we're placing on it for charging cars and heating water and all those things?
I'll speak on behalf of GMP over especially the time period that you're talking about. We feel very good about where both the grid is as well as where supply will be. Obviously need to keep seeing renewable energy projects and deployment, but we're actually more focused on whether and how we can do more to make sure that demand actually comes about. We've done a lot of modeling, which will be shown in our next IRP, regarding, you know, how circuits are doing, for example, if there were uncontrolled load coming on from electric vehicles, for example, and matching, you know, what generation is out there now and available and all of that. And at least in any time period you're talking about, even with a more aggressive acceleration curve that matches what EAN's put out, we don't see that concern in the shorter term. But to be clear, that doesn't mean that we need, you know, we need to keep going and work on procurement at the same time, really in parallel with load as it grows. But if I could, you know, kind of wave a wand, it would be to make all of us focus really strongly on making sure that load shows up.
Yeah, the only thing I would add as well is, yeah, I have very little concern about new renewable generation coming online. One of the things that we talked about specifically is how do you design a renewable energy standard? One of the design parameters is focus on in-state versus regional. We're part of the New England grid, and there's a planned 8 gigawatts of offshore wind, another 8 gigawatts of solar coming on into the region as a whole. You know, that's at least what ISO New England is planning for. So we still need to get into the design parameters of a res of how do you equitably design something that takes into account economic development associated with in-state generation versus potential cost reductions for out-of-state renewable generations. But either way, I think there's going to be plenty of renewable sources coming online to meet the expected load.
That's really good to hear. Thank you.
So yeah, I'd like to follow up on that a bit though. In-state versus out-of-state, that's just not mentioned at all in your presentation. I wondered about that. And also,
yeah, I'll take that one, but go ahead. Sorry, finish.
Oh, the second part is in addition to meeting existing and added load through renewables under a 100% standard, there's the question of replacing nuclear. I assume you're planning to replace nuclear with renewables. That's a big chunk.
Yeah, on the first one, Rich, you know, it's the risk of the shorter presentation. We did have and do have on presentations you've seen earlier, the longer list of questions that need to be addressed under res, one of them being in-state versus out-of-state. And at least just picking up on what Ed said before, it will be and should be both, right? And if we're going to move to 100% res, looking at how that grows, keeping in-state as a meaningful and growing part of the portfolio will be really important. So, but when it comes to our immediate Climate Council task of looking at how to reduce GHGs in the electricity sector, you know, we're trying to kind of keep the you know, eye on the prize of moving to 100%, and those other design choices definitely affect economic development, equity, you know, obviously directly customer costs, as well as potentially for individual homeowners and businesses, resiliency when it comes to local in-state. So there's lots of other things to consider in addition to greenhouse gas emissions. But our recommendation for the council level decision is focused on the greenhouse gas emissions reduction, which is the 100%. On nuclear, you know, we said clean or renewable. We do believe that there could be a policy discussion about which way to go. Either would be an improvement over where we are now, which is what we need to see from the electric sector in the longer term, 2030 and beyond, in order to make the supportive transition in the other sectors. So again, it's a question of what this council's role is and recommendations should be when considering that progress. So at least for, I know GMP's part, our goal is 2030 renewables. We do have nuclear in our portfolio. We will be making transitions in order to address that. You know, I should say, unless and until the state policy were to direct something different, but I do think those choices will be a part of the legislative discussion.
Dave?
Thanks. Liz and Ed, I'm curious as to the level of specificity you think that we as a subcommittee should be operating with to make these recommendations up to the council. Any general observations, any recommendations?
I mean, I guess it picks up on my comment to you and your presentation. If I had to, you know, characterize it briefly, I'd say between yours and ours. You know, it is really hard, and we should have as much conversation as we can about that now and in the next couple of meetings, because we need it to be meaningful for both the legislature and ANR and others who will be implementing the policies, and have a document that both is widely supported as well as sort of directional and inspirational and you know, action oriented, without getting bogged down in details that, you know, may prevent that from happening. I don't know what else to do there. I'd be really interested in others' feedback on that. This subcommittee has to make recommendations, so it's also, you know, really important for this group.
Yeah, I would agree. The one thing I would add to what Liz said, just a little bit more granular, the 100% res, the action is to actually study a design. And that is really important, because the design of a res is going to significantly impact the overall costs of electric to residential customers. You know, Dave, you mentioned that there's ways to optimize the electric grid, and completely agree with you on that. The concern, though, is the transmission costs that we're going to see increasing, distribution costs. We are going to see overall costs increase in the electric grid going forward. Those are manageable, and there's ways to minimize those costs. But when we're looking at the res, the cost needs to be a significant consideration in addition to the other societal goals, resilience, economic development, new versus existing. How much do we want that additionality versus maintaining existing resources? Lots and lots of issues. I don't see the subcommittee resolving all of those before December 1st. So in terms of level of granularity, I'd say, yeah, let's start moving towards ensure that our res can meet all the future electrification that we need at the lowest possible carbon emissions. But I wouldn't go much farther than that, but just my recommendation there.
Jared, do you have a reply on this point or something else?
Yeah, on this point, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about is what do we have to do by December 1st versus what can be done in further revisions or in future plans, or should be taken up with more specificity in terms of, you know, policy design by the legislature, administration, or program design by the implementing agencies. And as I think about that, you know, I go back to the Global Warming Solutions Act. I look at the language in statute, and the main clearly binding requirement is around emissions reduction. There are other things that we need to put forward in terms of, you know, they're spoken to broadly, but the thing that has the hard numbers around it are the emissions reductions, especially in this first plan, focusing on 2025 and 2030. And so as I've thought about kind of, you know, our responsibilities as counselors, both on this subcommittee and in the full council, it is primarily to make sure that we're putting forward pathways, strategies, and specifically actions that will add up to that, so that we can do our due diligence, meet our responsibility, and not get to this point of a cause of action which no one wants. And so for me, I think that the level of specificity doesn't need to go beyond saying 100% res or 100% carbon free by X date. That will tell us what we need to know in terms of the emissions reduction that will come from the sector. These other considerations, which are important, but you know, how much of that is in-state versus out of state, how much is tier 1 versus tier 2 versus another tier that could be created, those to me have more to do with cost effectiveness, with resilience, are things that are important and need to be figured out, but they're not going to come to bear on the question of what adds up to meeting the emissions reduction requirements. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Jared. I do have a response which I think goes probably, it's not inconsistent with what you just said, but I do believe we have a responsibility, not just to put the down words on paper that would theoretically yield the reductions that you're referring to. I think we owe a responsibility to the council to recommend a suite of actions that we believe are realistically implementable and affordable, and meet the reduction requirements. And that's the purpose of this committee. So in fact, to be fair to everybody, I believe that that we have been doing reality testing on these ideas from the get-go, and we aren't proposing pie in the sky. We're proposing realistic actions, and it would be wrong of us if we didn't. And if anybody disagrees with me on that, we should have that conversation right away. But I think it's the charge of this committee to present actions that when people say to us, can this work? Can we pay for it? Is it realistic? We can say yes, yes, yes to all those questions.
I agree, Richard. All I was trying to say was that I think that if we can agree on the broad targets, and it's going to take more dialogue and figuring out the exact final design, I don't think that should hold us up from making the recommendation with as much specificity as we can get to over the next.
I mean, the plan doesn't have to include all those details, but I do believe we must have done our homework to believe that the recommendations are solid and
agreed,
actionable.
Do want to make sure we have time to get to the sort of prioritization discussion, because I think that will sort of wrap this conversation up a little bit of in a bow. I'm going to make a recommendation that non-energy cedes its time to transportation, because I think that's where most of our discussion points are. I would flag that the only real change in any of the ideas that we brought forward to you from non-energy is that the proceeding in front of the PUC around Global Foundries self-managed utility piece has moved forward a little further, and we are maybe ask Ed to speak a little bit to the letter of intent that's out there, but with the goal in mind of having Global Foundries be looking at their overall greenhouse gas emissions as part of this proceeding, and something that will help us meet their industrial emissions as well as their overall fuel use emissions and electricity emissions. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think you summarized it pretty high level for which should be good for right now. I will say that the PUC proceedings have now been delayed. It's looking like hearings have been moved from 2 weeks from now to potentially sometime in January. So we're still having some discussions with Global Foundries about best GHG reduction measures. The finalization or a conclusion by the PUC is going to be pushed out farther than we had originally thought. So instead of the year, it'll probably be sometime early second quarter of 2022.
All right, thanks, Ed. And thanks, Peter. We'll see how far we get on transportation and maybe come back to you.
Thank you, Peter, for ceding your time. I'm going to say a couple things. And maybe, sorry. Hang on. Sorry. There's somebody at my door. This does not really happen in the pandemic very often, so I'm just going to ignore them. Or I'm just going to ignore them. I'm so sorry. Who let the dogs out? Thanks, Chris. Okay, so thank you, Peter, for ceding your time. Sorry about that kerfluffle. I don't have a cat, so I don't usually get the cat on the screen moment that I've envied from so many others. But that's Samson. Say hi. I guess I just want to say apologies for not coming, with the PowerPoint I do understand and certainly see the value in it. So we will do our best to highlight, the specific actions, especially those that I think would really benefit from tugging it out a little bit further here. But we've been working really hard to actually put these ideas on the table and get to a place where we can really assess the different strategies and put a finer point on, like, these are the fundamental things that we think should be included in the plan. So I'm going to turn it over to Gina. She can walk through, provide a little bit more of an overview, and then I'll sort of highlight some of the things in the Excel sheet that Gina had sent out, where we could focus the conversation around the actions.
Okay, so we've spent some time on a background statement, why action is necessary, and our process to date in the approach. And for background, transportation's the state largest greenhouse gas emissions sector. Roughly 40% of Vermont's emissions come from the movement of people and goods. It's a sector that is wholly reliant on the combustion of fossil fuels and a technology that's been around since the Model T. We believe this needs to change. Nearly half of what Vermonters spend on energy is for transportation, and lower income Vermonters spend a far greater proportion of their incomes on energy across the board, including transportation. The state imports almost all of its transportation fossil fuels. These fuels are not produced or refined here. That means it's a huge drain on our economy. Vermonters send about $800 million annually out of state for the money we spend on gasoline and diesel. Vermonters and most Americans' personal and economic lives are linked to the convenience of being able to go wherever they want, whenever they choose, on safe and reliable roadways. Addressing transportation emissions means not only finding new fuels and vehicle technologies that provide the same level of convenience and are as carbon-free as possible, but also rethinking our relationship with the automobile. Replacing car trips with walking and biking for those that can, and in places where it's possible, makes for better health outcomes. Transit service allows commuters to avoid driving, stress, relax, or get work done, and is often the only option for those not in a position to own a car. But if the service is to be widely accepted and used, the time spent on the bus and access to destination should be as similar as possible to driving the same route. Walking and biking, transit, microtransit, and other non-single occupancy vehicle modes are reliant on a certain level of density and mix of land uses. The state has long held concentrated mixed use city, small town, and village centers surrounded by rural countryside as a state land use goal. Regional and local planning efforts to recognize this and the multiple benefits of avoiding sprawling growth that burdens infrastructure, lessens the viability of forestry, agriculture, and conservation, and contributes to water quality and flooding challenges. Not having access to automobile significantly affects a person's employment options and quality of life. For those with vehicles, owning and operating one is a significant portion of a family's living costs, and we're going to insert that number in here. This percentage increase is percentage increases in the most rural parts of the state and for low-income residents. Transportation is a federal, multi-state, regional, state, and local partnership. The federal government, as well as groups of states under California Emissions and ZEB program, regulate vehicle emissions and efficiency. The upkeep of roads and bridges, transit and rail programs, and more are funded in large part through federal programs and subject to federal policies and requirements. So that's the large background. Why action is necessary. Business as usual is not acceptable. A transportation system transformation is required in order to meet the emissions goals. And we want to be able to plug in what this means. X number, and we're hoping the consultants, as we get into more of their results, this means X number of fully electric light duty vehicles representing X number of fossil fuel, replacing, X number of fossil fuel light duty vehicles by 2030 and X number by 2050 if the state's emissions goals are to be met. And then we will have similar numbers for heavy duty for 2030 and 2050 to get to the emissions goals. And this, we've been talking to consultants about getting those numbers. It also means reducing VMT by X% and increasing bike, ped, transit, and rail trips by a corresponding percentage. As noted above, as I've noted previously, there are economic costs associated with exporting dollars spent on fuel out of state entities, and transportation costs are burdened on many Vermont households. The goal is to keep energy dollars circulating in the Vermont economy and spent on locally produced electricity, not fossil fuels from elsewhere, and reducing transportation costs to Vermonters by introducing cleaner and more efficient technologies and more affordable means of transportation. We know that transportation emissions, especially diesel, have known health consequences. And increasing traffic levels makes Vermont roadways unsafe, and repairs require costly improvements to address congestion and long-term wear and tear. So those are some co-benefits of reducing VMT. So the process to date are, we've done the following. We've looked at, the state has been considering transportation greenhouse gas emissions for over a decade. There are numerous EV, transit, rideshare, and other programs in place that form the basis of our work ahead. They merit continuation, scaling up, and modification to address equity and other concerns. So we really took a close look at what the state's already doing. EAN has worked cooperatively with state agencies, collected all the available data, and mapped out pathway alternatives. The consultants are now going to take EAN's work and model the various scenarios to help understand the pros and cons of different strategies and actions. This information is going to feed into what we're presenting. Efforts in other states such as California, New York, and Massachusetts have helped inform what we've come up with. There have been consultation with transportation, other state, regional, and local officials, planners, and transportation professionals. The workshop that the Public Service Department hosted in August was very helpful, and DEC air quality staff Megan O'Toole and Deirdre Ritzer have provided a really important technical assistance. So let's see. So our pathways, and Joey is going to delve more into this through the spreadsheet. Our pathways include, and you've heard us say this already, light and heavy duty electrification, increasing the overall efficiency of all registered cars and trucks in Vermont, decreasing VMT, and increasing transportation choices and the associated land use patterns necessary for this to occur, reducing the carbon intensity of fuels, and effective administration and coordination to make these programs happen. There are several critical considerations that enable the actions to go forward and meet the intention of the Global Warming Solutions Act. They include the development of a complementary equity and environmental justice policy or policies, incentivizing clean and efficient fuel and technology choices, and disincentivizing the purchase of gas guzzlers, obtaining the necessary and sustainable funding to move new and expanded state and local programs going forward, and making sure all state spending decisions support and not contradict efforts to reduce emissions and make the state more resilient. Increasing state government ability to undertake planning and analysis, coordination with regional and local government and social service NGOs, and manage expanded and new programs. Finding workforce development opportunities as part of the transformation, and focusing on technologies that are available and affordable now, while maintaining flexibility to allow for new technologies as they evolve and enter the mainstream. So that's the background, the framing, and now Joey is going to get into the actions themselves around those pathways that I just mentioned.
Yep. Thank you, Gina. I just dropped in the chat a link to the Excel document that we put together just so you can potentially follow along. But I really want to highlight, to get to the different pathways and the strategies, we've identified a few fundamental things just to put on the table to unpack, because we are running out of time. So to actually fund the programs, electrification, fuel efficiency, endeavors like Replace Your Ride and Mileage Smart, as well as the transportation demand management strategies that we know we are going to need now and certainly to expand in the future. We're going to need the sort of enabling tools that create that and create the funding to actually make the transformation. So just to put on the table, more specifically, some of the things we want to talk to you more about is joining the Transportation and Climate Initiative. This is, as Gina noted, as you know, we've talked about a regional cap and invest program. Our neighbors are participating in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Washington, D.C. It is a key tool that to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% over a decade. Yes, it is imperfect, and it is certainly not sufficient because it is 30% reductions through the CAP program alone. But importantly, it would raise about $20 million annually to fund the types of diverse programs that we know we are going to need. So not only will it require pollution reduction progress and manifest that, it will help raise the revenue to do the work that we've identified. Very importantly for us, it is simultaneously advancing a complementary policy that ensures equity outcomes, that establishes an equity board, that sets a minimum level investment to go to low income, overburdened, historically marginalized Vermonters. So this is a big policy. We are putting it on the table as one of the fundamental policies that we believe we need to see in this plan and look to really sort of refine the equity provisions with Kaya and others because that is fundamental to its success. Also, I think fundamental is just continuing to participate in and expand our participation in the California Emission Standards Program and the technology forcing programs like the low emissions vehicle program and the zero emissions vehicle programs. You'll see that here on our spreadsheet. These programs are really, set the stage for it, clean fleets and a more clean access to clean vehicles and electric vehicles in the state of Vermont. There are several of them. And we fundamentally believe these are key to, continuing to transform our little state and help Vermonters avail themselves of cleaner, more efficient vehicles, light duty, medium duty, and ultimately heavy duty. So fundamentally too, again, as Gina said, as you know, in terms of vehicle miles traveled reduction strategies, that is going to be a critical component and really looking to lean on, our existing network, but continue to expand it and invest in it and really focus on sort of, the like microtransit, for example, has been identified by our partners at Capstone as sort of a fundamental component to expand upon the existing transportation system to actually be more nimble, more flexible, and fill the gaps that Vermonters, low-income Vermonters in particular, are finding when it comes to getting them out of their cars and giving them options for getting where they need to go. So really leaning into expanding our transit system, expanding one specific action we are recommending is extending fare-free transit. This is really enabling transit to be more affordable and accessible to Vermonters. So essentially what we're talking about really is really building off the transportation programs that we have in place now, our electric vehicle incentive programs, our high mileage incentive programs like Mileage Smart and Replace Your Ride that include Replace Your Ride critically includes a scrappage component. So that means getting dirtier, older vehicles off the roads and helping Vermonters, again, lower income, overburdened Vermonters in particular, really access more clean, efficient transportation options. So I think what you will see in the more detailed spreadsheet and in a more cohesive PowerPoint coming up is really sort of that near-term focus on electrification and vehicle efficiency, again, is fundamental to moving Vermonters in our rural state as a shorter-term strategy as well as building the more integrated transportation demand management system over time, and focusing in on the land use and smart growth strategies that we're very much looking forward to working with rural resilience and ag and ecosystems on more specifically. So I wanted to sort of maybe stop there because it's a lot, especially just talking at you. And just
I want to say one thing. We really looked at EV purchase incentives and charging equipment and the state's current program, and some work that VTrans is just about to get underway with VEIC to really take a deep dive in those programs. So you know, we at this point we're relying on them to the extent that they need to be scaled up and modified is unknown, and part of that research is going to occur in the coming months. So I just want to say a really important part are the incentives and the charging stations, and Joey hasn't mentioned that, it'll come out in the PowerPoint, and we're building on what the state's already doing in this instance and some research that's about to go on with VIC.
All right, thanks very much, guys. Questions, comments? I'll just toss in a quick observation and a question. You didn't mention specifically, except by referring to the existing programs, state incentives or a plan for making charging points available for electric vehicles.
I mean, it is all in there, I guess, and this is where.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, it probably needs to be mentioned in the presentation.
The study is very, yes, and that's why I tried to mention at the end here. The study that it just came to our attention. A grant agreement has been penned literally 2 weeks ago, and it specifies the areas that they're going to look at, including providing low and moderate income, you know, dealing with multifamily housing and low moderate income families and their access to charging. That's really important, and that's going to be included in that study.
But I've dropped the specific recommended action here is based on that study. Fund further build out of level. Go ahead.
It's fine. It just
believe me, that hasn't been forgotten.
And on the reducing vehicle miles traveled in relation to smart growth, the spreadsheet has text referring to the need to study that and identify what those benefits are. Is that correct? That would be the action?
Well, the action is to understand the VMT benefits of Vermont's land use patterns, and that's something that is being talked about with various consultants between the state and with CADMIS and with other consultants with VTrans. Our feeling is we need to try to better understand what the VMT benefits are of smart growth. We know there's a ton of reasons to do smart growth, but knowing what those emissions benefits are needs to be understood. Then from there, we can begin to better quantify the emissions benefits. But the first step is to get a handle on how land use in Vermont and smart growth affects VMT. We don't know that. We are looking at a national literature search with CADMIS, and VTrans is talking about a study. There's other studies going on that I can't keep track of around this issue. But at this point, right now, we don't know what the VMT benefits are of smart growth in Vermont.
Right. I understand the point. Well, and it's worth noting that, as Dave pointed out in the housing presentation, the Vermont housing stock is what it is, and we need to design policies that deal with that. And similarly, the locations of buildings in Vermont are pretty much what they are now. And so to the degree that smart growth is going to affect VMT, this has to do with new construction and development patterns over time, but for the most part, in between now and 2030, the buildings are where they are. So, we have to be realistic about that.
Well, there's infill, and there's growing up and density increases within our village centers.
Well, sure, that's certainly has been a policy of the state for a long time. It's just that the rate of new construction being as low as it is.
Yes.
We have to just be realistic about modeling that properly.
I mean, in a nutshell, the electrification, we got to do it. It's going to help us. We're going to start right now, and we're all hands on deck. The VMT reduction, the alternative modes, is something we can't stop doing, but we're not going to be able to reap the benefits, or at least demonstrate the benefits, until further down the line. That's
Okay.
sort of the overall approach we're talking about. It doesn't mean we stop doing it.
Agreed. And that's a good way of presenting the message to the council, I think.
Yes, that's what we're going to do when we have our fancy
Chris, and then I think we need to wrap this one up.
I was just going to say, in characterizing this in the presentation and when we write, it might be helpful for the general public to understand that we really are talking about future VMT impacts of smart growth. The reason I'm mentioning that is for those of us who've had our heads in this stuff for a while, I think we know what we're expecting of the public, but the public, oftentimes the pushback that you get or the feedback you get is this concern that, well, are you expecting me to just get an EV tomorrow? Or are you expecting me to just move out of my house and move someplace else tomorrow? And we just need to make clear, no, we're not expecting anybody to do that.
Right.
I know that sounds obvious, but I think it actually will help with the framing of all of this and help it make sense to more people who just don't think about this policy stuff all the time. So I just wanted to put that out there. Gina, I'll keep looking to see what I can find. But you're right. There's so many other variables, right? Like even how we continue to go back to work, broadband, you got growth of trade indices or shrinkage of trade industries and all kinds of other things about how many miles we're going to travel in the future as we have more smart growth patterns. It's a challenging thing to measure. So I'll keep seeing what I can find, but I think it's kind of hard to quantify right now.
It's good. It's comforting to hear a planner say that. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And similarly, we're hoping to reassure people that we're not going to suddenly outlaw their oil furnace and make them go change their heating system either. We have just about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to take some public comments. Is there anything we're going to?
Before we do that, we do need to, Jay needs to give us an overview of the prioritization discussion that's been happening so that we know our next steps. I appreciate that there's interest in public comment, and we'll get to that, but we need to get through that discussion first.
Thanks, Peter. Jane?
Yeah, thank you for that, Peter and Richard, for the time. And I had hoped that we would have some significant time to dive into this with you all, but being that we don't, I'm going to try to orient you briefly to the documents that I sent and direct you all to really dive deep into them and ask any questions. But the expectation and recognition is that now that the comprehensive list of actions has been completed by the separate task leads, that we need to move really quickly into prioritization of your actions. And we have tailored that to think about it as a stepwise approach, recognizing that we want to move forward with all high priority actions and then think about where your medium and low actions fall. The intent being is that low priority actions will be viewed in an appendix in the climate action plan, and medium, you'll have the discretion as a group to reconsider how you want to elevate those forward. So what I encourage you to look at first and foremost is the 3 or 4 PowerPoint slides that I sent you all in an email last night that details out that process. And then the accompanying document that you'll have with that as well are the definitions that we're proposing for the foundational criteria. And you'll see for impact or progress towards the GWSA requirements, and as well as cost effectiveness, two of the most sort of impactful, well, I shouldn't use the word impactful to describe impact, but two of the most important criteria for how you really, the overall ranking is going to come out are different for cross-sector mitigation than they are for rural resilience and ag and ecosystems. And we've tried to tease that out. And then we've further broken them down by how you'll use those definitions to break out your priorities as high, medium, and low. And at the bottom of that definition spreadsheet has how the overall impact will come together for all high and medium priority actions. And the ones that are not like in that table, the combinations, I should say, that are not illustrated in that table are all will all be low priority actions, and therefore not carry forward into the body of the CAP, but be put into an appendix for further consideration for future iterations of the CAP. And so the intent really is to do that first crack at prioritization in the next week in your sectoral groups and then to come back together as a group to look at all your high priority actions by sector and then consider what your medium priority actions are and how you want to move those forward as a group and as a consensus for cross-sector mitigation. The recognition is that first step of prioritization needs to happen with all of you as a way to get to those actions that you want to dive deep and spend significant time with Kaya in the following week, looking at your equity screening and application of the scoring rubric as a group. And so I know that Peter and I have been going back and forth. Jared and Peter helped me really refine what the definition would be for to put forward for cross-sector for your high, medium, and low impact actions. And the only thing I really want to test with you all is one, the timeline, and two, a recognition that without detailed modeling around your greenhouse gas mitigation benefits for the specific actions, how your ability to actually apply the percent reduction scenario that we put into the definition. So Jared, my understanding, and this is my phone a friend moment, Jared, was that the gut check could happen without detailed analysis about an understanding about how much action those actions will take, how much greenhouse gas reduction benefit each action will have, and we can do that based on professional judgment and lean into the modeling to refine it as it comes forward.
Yeah, I do think that there are some actions that really lend themselves to being obviously easy to categorize because the action is structured in a way in which you know what the emissions reduction amount would be. There are others that are kind of spoken to in a broader manner, and absent additional modeling or more specificity for that action, they're really going to be difficult to categorize in that impact framework.
Yep. So I guess my feeling is I'd love for you all in the next day or so to look at what I sent out last night. Any like deep concerns, let me know. It'll be going in front of the council on Tuesday to actually review and approve the definitions for the criteria, barring any significant change, which I hope there won't be, knowing that it's really guidance at the subcommittee level and that we've done our best to work with science and data to inform the definitions as well. At this point, that I would really encourage folks to start to dive in, and Marion and I will be working to add the columns on and unhide if you don't have them already in your spreadsheet. That's actually more true for ag and eco and rural resilience than it is for you, because those columns are all in those template docs, just hidden right now for prioritization. And so we'll work with you all to do anything you need to bring those forward or provide state staff to support that. But that's really going to be the critical next steps with your actions in order to then elevate the conversation with Kaya.
All right, thank you, Jane. So the takeaway here is look at the slides you sent, see if we have any problems with them, and immediately respond. And then further to apply them and do some prioritization first, and then working with Kaya, we're going to be working through the prioritization process again. Have I got that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, Kaya will work with you all, and we'll have a meeting to tee that up with Kaya, with the co-chairs, in order to strategically look at what the actions are that are coming out highest and how we want to best use our time in the group to actually apply the scoring rubric, which in best case scenario, if things are moving as well as they can, that would be 2 weeks from today.
Okay.
So Jane, just to put a fine point on it, for next week, we'd like each of the task leads to attempt to run their actions through the prioritization framework and bring those results with them for discussion so that we can help answer any questions, refine as a group, so that it can then flow into the conversation with Kaya next week, the following week.
That would be
Yeah.
great. Okay. And,
Thank
you know, and we know that some of the answers are going to be found in the program designs. You know, like a high priority item might be really problematic if addressed in one way, and might be significantly more equitable if addressed in a different way. So to some degree, this is a process of refining and improving the high priority items as necessary. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah,
Is
and the
there-
prioritization speaks to that, Richard, just so when you guys dive in, hopefully
Yeah.
you'll see that there.
Right. Thanks. All right. And thanks for giving us the timeline to work that through. We're on such a tight timeline to begin with. Peter, is there anything more, or Jane, anything more before we go to public comment? And I hope people can stick around and listen to the public comments. Let's begin with Annette.
Thank you. This is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. And I'll just note, I appreciate you guys are all slammed for time, but this is like the 4th meeting that I've been in that you all have run over time, and already 5 people have dropped off. So the public comment becomes it's just frustrating from the public's perspective. I want to speak specifically to the electricity specificity and how detailed you are going to get in it. And I am going to get specific and speak about what I will call the elephant in the room that I think needs to be discussed, and that is onshore in-state Vermont industrial wind. I am aware that it has not been talked about at Ag and Ecosystems. I brought it up in Science and Data when there was a discussion about health and health effects that were being modeled based on proximity, for instance, to fossil fuel generators. There are health effects from proximity to industrial wind turbines, and I don't know, and I would expect that won't be included in it. And I don't expect that Just Transitions has actually talked about what has happened in Vermont regarding the divisiveness that occurs in Vermont's communities when industrial wind projects are proposed. David Blittersdorf has a lawyer who has submitted filings in the standard offer program that say that the Global Warming Solutions Act is going to mandate industrial wind. He has just gotten a standard offer contract for a 1.5 megawatt wind turbine in Rutland County. He has hired someone to go around to 5 towns offering money. Nobody in the community knows anything about it. I've known about it for a couple of months, and I haven't told anybody because honestly, it makes me physically ill to think what's going to happen to these 5 communities and how divided they're going to become by being riled up over we have to address climate change versus, oh no, please don't do this to us, what's happened to other communities. It's going to be ugly, and I think that it is very germane to the Climate Council's work. I see that at the public forums, some Energy Action Network literature was being handed out. And I know that in the past, some of the annual reports have included mandates or recommendations or projections for over 100 megawatts of new wind. And I think that if it's not specifically addressed through this process, that it opens the door wide to the developers coming in and saying, oh, well, there are no concerns raised about it. There are no issues. And so, of course, there is no problem with it. Whereas the Ag and Ecosystems actually has solar listed. They don't have wind listed in their spreadsheet. So I want to flag this for you because I want to see us work together to make this transition possible. And I am so tired of seeing the fighting that goes on and have personally witnessed just the destruction of people's lives due to industrial wind development. And now it's going to be happening again over one wind turbine, and it's going to be just as ugly as if it was a whole ridgeline full. And I ask you to please be specific in whether or not it is your intention to enable more industrial wind turbines in Vermont. And I will also note that Vermont is getting zero benefit from the renewable energy because all of the RECs are sold out of state. So thank you, and that is my comment.
Thanks, Annette. George?
Good afternoon. So I've been listening to today's presentations from the different sectors, and the common theme that seemed to emerge to my mind was, frankly, an absence of concrete statements with regards to many different factors that I would have expected to have found in a presentation going through the Climate Council's recommendations. For example, estimated costs of public investment, quantities of new capacity in, you name it, solar or PV or wind, all the LEAP modeling that is going on. I would have thought that was going to be front and center to informing these recommendations and bringing some clarity to what currently seems very fuzzy. I recognize forecasting obviously is always imperfect, but at this point, it looks almost like it was not included in these recommendations, at least the ones that are publicly visible. If there's actual concrete numbers buried inside the configuration of the LEAP modeling, those should be part of the public policy discussions and placed into the recommendations as part of what drove the decision making. I thought there would have been schedules that showed predicted arrival rates of things. If you're going to deploy heat pumps in each year of the year in the forecast, you would expect to see a forecast of how many heat pumps and how you're going to get them there. How are you going to finance them? What organization is accountable for actually installing or watching over them to ensure progress towards goal? None of the discussions so far have talked about the rate base impact. If you're going to develop large quantities of infrastructure, whether it be solar or wind, in the portfolio of the utilities, what's the scale of that? When is it happening? What's the way that you're going to provide that investment without having an equitable and disproportionate impact on those of lesser means? So all these things are currently, from my perspective, not visible in the current set of recommendations that I've been seeing here. So I grant you guys have been running under a hard deadline, and that makes it much more difficult to accommodate these kinds of issues, but they are front and center. And if I was looking at them, frankly, on the receiving end, I would say the specificity is so vague that it's not available for approval. It doesn't have the substance needed to inform a proper decision. Setting that aside, when I hear about the clean heat standard, I also have concerns about the reliance on biofuels and perhaps also wood heat. These are currently viewed and treated as zero emissions, for whatever reason, carbon neutral. But I think a life cycle assessment of the biofuels in particular is overdue. If one goes up the chain of events that are currently used to the process by which we currently do biodiesel or a heating oil that's got a bio component in it, you're looking at significant amounts of soybean growth with huge land impacts and emissions from those type of operations. And there's a big question mark about the renewable fuel standard at the federal level, whether it's even anywhere near successful. The first generation technologies that they use today are at best a stepping stone towards other technologies that have yet to mature. And so your reliance on biofuels may be a misstep. And until a life cycle assessment is invalidated, that it's a secure place to step and place your bet on, I would recommend you take that on the back burner, place it on the back burner, and place other options as higher priority and more likely to succeed. With respect to wood pellets and other thermal uses for biomass, this also has land use impacts. And again, they have not yet been fully quantified. And ag and ecosystems, I think, is on point for developing that and kind of looking at the carbon sequestration rates of managed forests versus those that are unmanaged. In other words, in their natural state and not logged. That should inform whether or not allocating land to managed forest actually is a reasonable choice. The assessments I've seen so far in the academic studies would suggest that it is not a good idea to expand managed forest and expand logging. And my concern is the clean heat standard might actually be a prescription for just that. Thank you for your time. I hope these questions help inform your future discussions and shape a more successful plan. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Any other comments from members of the public? All right, then. Thanks to the committee for today's meeting. Good discussions.
And please,
closing comments.
I would just say, if you have time, take a look at the slides that on prioritization that Jane sent out as quickly as possible, because you are likely to have questions, and the sooner we can get to answering some of those questions, the better. So appreciate everybody's time. It's a lot to get through today.
I look forward to that. I assume that's at your website page?
Sorry, George, I was speaking to the subcommittee members. I'm not sure yet, Jane, if those PowerPoint slides
Marion,
are.
I believe Marion's put them up.
Okay.
They'll be up in just a minute. We had some website issues, so they'll be up soon.
All right, thanks, Marion. All right, then.
All.
Thank you all. We're adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.